Hey everybody, DreamRoom64 here. Today's topic is about a new software emulation solution, which is, for me, not something I typically ever talk about. I'm a person who primarily enjoys original hardware, and I've had many subpar experiences over the years with software emulation. Problems ranging from configuration frustration to high input lag and an overall inauthentic feeling in the end. While I understand that for a while now, emulators can perform incredibly well and beat original hardware in many aspects, I never found the process of tweaking and configuring emulators appealing at all. I much prefer tackling the headaches and expense of wiring up original consoles, and I'm not kidding about that. I really do enjoy that process more. Well, anyway, the news is that I finally found an emulation solution that overcomes most of the typical emulation shortcomings. This solution is designed to have low input lag. It natively works with CRTs at original resolutions like 240p. It's pre-configured for an optimized experience, so you don't have to spend a bunch of time in menus, and it comes wrapped in an intuitive, no-frills user interface. It's basically everything I could ask for. I even lag tested it against original hardware, and we'll share those results later in this video. It's called RePlayOS. It's currently in beta, and it will be a free download available publicly roughly a few weeks or so from this video's release. It's a new operating system designed to run exclusively on Raspberry Pi 3, 4, and 5, with support planned for future Pi models. This is the first time I've ever bought and played around with a Raspberry Pi. So let me take a minute to briefly explain what I've learned about this and how it works for anyone who doesn't keep up to date on this stuff like myself. And if you don't want to hear this section, feel free to skip ahead. I've included chapters in this video. Also, any gameplay footage I show in this video was recorded while I played on my newly purchased Pi 5 running RePlayOS. Raspberry Pis are small single-board computers designed to be affordable. And while they've become increasingly less affordable over the years, like just about everything else in life, the currently recommended version for running RePlayOS is the Pi 5 2GB model. The good news here is that this is the cheapest version of the latest generation Raspberry Pi. It's only $50 and it doesn't seem to have any trouble staying in stock. And you don't need to get one of the more expensive models with more RAM because RAM is not the emulation performance bottleneck. With this 2GB model, you can smoothly emulate all the way up to Dreamcast, which I'll talk more about later. So aside from the $50 Pi 5, there are just a few more things needed to get started. The first one being a case to put the board in and to provide cooling. Cases range from around as little as about $17 on the low end to about $90 on the high end. The case, though, that I recommend is a $30 miniature replica Nintendo 64 called the RetroFlag 64 Pi case. I think it looks really cool, the build quality is fantastic, assembly is easy, and it comes with thermal pads, a little metal heat spreader, and a fan that runs quietly from my experience. The case provides two front USB ports for controllers and access to the sideboards under a little removable cover. Both the power switch and reset buttons are fully functional when using RePlayOS. Under another little cover is a small storage area that you can stash something in, like a spare microSD card. So if you want to run a different operating system on your Pi 5 occasionally, you can swap that memory card in and use it for a second purpose. I find that little detail a fun play on the original Nintendo 64 expansion slot. On the topic of memory cards, you'll need one to install RePlayOS onto, and it's also where you'll store your ROMs. I first tested RePlayOS on an old microSD card that I had laying around, but I found that an outdated card will affect performance in some emulators, like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. I had a great experience using a modern Amazon Basics 512GB microSD card. These are reputable, very low-priced cards with 512 gigs, offering the best value per gigabyte today, and they perform great. I believe they're actually manufactured by Lexar, despite the Amazon Basics branding. As always, avoid questionably sourced memory cards and fakes because those will only end in frustration. Aside from the case of your choice, a 2GB Pi 5, and a microSD card, you'll need a couple cords, the first being a power supply for the Pi 5. Although the Pi 5 is powered via a USB-C connector, it has pretty high power requirements compared to a typical USB-powered device. I recommend simply getting the official power supply for $12 because it's unlikely that you'll have a spare power brick on hand to use with it. The only brick that I have on hand that meets the required specs is a $20 Anchor brick, which doesn't even include a cable, so at $12, the official power supply is a pretty good buy. Finally, you'll need the appropriate HDMI cable. The Pi 5 has two uncommonly sized HDMI ports on the back called micro HDMI. To connect to a typical TV, you'll need a micro HDMI to HDMI cable. To connect instead to the upcoming RGB Pi 2 adapter for use with CRT TVs via RGB SCART, you'll need a micro HDMI to mini HDMI cable to connect between that device and the Pi 5. I plan to focus more on the RGB Pi 2 adapter later, which will be in a second part follow-up to this video. For any of those specialty HDMI cables required, the cost is about $8 each. And as I noted, the Pi 5 has 2 HDMI outputs. RePlayOS impressively supports independent outputs to 2 screens simultaneously for dual screen play. While I haven't tested this feature yet, it sounds really cool and like a great way to emulate the Nintendo DS on dual screens or to emulate a multi-monitor arcade machine. So far, I've tested the Nintendo DS emulation briefly, but only with a single TV. The dual display mode will work with both CRTs and modern TVs, and it won't require any special configuration. This is another capability of RePlayOS that I'd like to cover in my follow-up video. All right, let's talk about the cost. So all in, the build cost for my particular build is $163. Driving up the cost is my decision to buy an 8BitDo Ultimate 2C controller for $30 to take advantage of RePlayOS's high polling rate support. I also happen to like the battery life and button feel of this controller, especially the D-pad. I hate to say it, but I think I like this D-pad better than the original Super Nintendo controller's D-pad. And for me, it's a painful thing to admit that, but technology has progressed in this regard. The D-pad also on the 2.4G 8BitDo M30 controller, also compatible with RePlayOS, is similarly amazing, possibly even more so, but its 6-button layout doesn't feel right to me for a lot of Nintendo games and Super Nintendo games where I like to roll my thumb across the buttons. For a budget build where you don't feel the need to buy a new controller and where a few other costs are cut, the build price drops to just $100. Basically, this is a very accessible and affordable option to get into retro gaming. And to make it easy, I'll place Amazon affiliate links as well as a brief explanation for everything needed in the video description so that you don't have to go through the trouble of trying to track everything down if you're interested in this. Now, the most important part, how does it look and feel to play games using RePlayOS on a 2GB Pi 5? Well, from my experience, it's pretty awesome. RePlayOS is optimized for the Pi hardware with the intention of minimizing input lag. Its video output options are simple and prioritize sharp integer scaling and give the option to apply scanline effects at your preferred strength. I greatly appreciate that RePlayOS doesn't have blurry scaling options like many emulators, and there's no getting lost in menus here and excessively tinkering. It supports output resolutions all the way from 240p up to 4K. Though the 4K resolution is listed as experimental currently, I've had a very good experience running it so far, even in this early beta release. I've had good results also using the experimental 1440p output on a computer monitor. Performance is great, and frame rates hold steady at any output from my experience so far. Most impressive, though, is the 240p output intended for CRTs. I tested the 240p output mode via a rather generic lag-free HDMI to component video converter, and it's a wonderful feature to have in an emulator. It's so nice to be able to play on a real CRT. Soon there's going to be an officially supported digital to analog converter, the aforementioned RGB Pi 2, which will have optimal chips, no added lag, guaranteed compatibility with RePlayOS. I'm very excited to try that out later, but for now, I've gotten by at least using my generic DAC for basic testing. I've run into some issues with my generic DAC, so I'm really looking forward to getting that officially supported solution, the RGB Pi 2. Now let's address a big concern, latency. After using RePlayOS to play some 2D platformer classics that I know well, I can confidently say that it feels extraordinarily responsive and accurate overall. I don't find myself missing any jumps or feeling the weighty feeling associated with high input lag that I've often felt with emulators. But I wanted to take things a step further and be slightly scientific. I decided to compare RePlayOS against true original hardware running on a lag-free CRT. I tried to think of a testing solution, and here it is. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, but it's decent enough. So what I did was I took a double pole, single throw light switch and wired 2 pairs of leads onto it. This type of switch lets me simultaneously activate a button press on 2 separate controllers with reasonably good accuracy. Using my hands to try to activate button presses on 2 controllers simultaneously would be far too inaccurate. The switch independently completes 2 circuits. I ran many trials and swapped between both sides of the switch during testing. For fun, and since I hope to use this switch in future videos and similar tests, I encased it in a piece of scrap walnut wood. Now it looks a little bit more legit and a little bit more presentable on camera. The wires coming out of it are scrap speaker wires. Now to get the controllers attached to it, the solution is rather simple. I disassembled 4 original controllers, one from the NES, one from the Genesis, and one from the Xbox 360. And finally, one from the failed PS1 Classic mini console. The idea here is to use the NES and Genesis controllers for testing original consoles, and then to use the 2 USB controllers for testing RePlayOS. To remotely activate a button press, I soldered wires to the main button of each controller, which the light switch would then later connect and complete the circuit. On the NES controller, this was particularly easy. It was just a matter of following the traces to the A button and cleanly soldering small wires to the blobs of solder on the board. I did the same for the Genesis controller, which was also easy to follow and solder to. As for the Xbox 360 controller, I opted to scrape at the board a bit to reveal some bare copper. I then used these as my solder points and routed the test wires out of the accessory port. Finally, I wired up a PS1 Classic controller from the mini console. I never owned the mini console, but I found this loose controller in heavily used condition recently for a few dollars at a flea market, and I decided to give it a try. Curiously, the memory card themed USB cable is connected internally via a standard micro USB connector. The cord was worn out and failing when I first tested the controller out, so I replaced it with a generic USB cable during this mod process. Soldering to this controller was quite a bit trickier than the others. The circuit board is tiny, and I couldn't simply follow the traces. Fortunately, a kind Redditor posted a graphic about 6 years ago with a complete pinout for this controller's board. I was able to follow their work and successfully wire up the X button by soldering to the correct points. Now you're probably wondering, why use a PS1 Classic controller for a lag test? Well, in a community source MiSTer controller latency webpage, this exact controller is listed as having only 2 milliseconds of latency, which puts it among the best controllers in this regard, and I happen to have it on hand already. So since this is not a sponsored video, I didn't want to spend money buying a brand new controller to mod for this very low budget test, and the stakes were very low to wire this one up. Also, I couldn't find any reliable documentation on the wired Xbox 360 controller's latency, so I only used it very briefly during some initial testing. As for the test results, well, original hardware wins in every test, but not by much. It's typically a total difference of roughly 2 frames. Sometimes I measure as low as 1, and occasionally I measure 3 frames, but this could be testing error, I think it is. Roughly 2 seems to be the norm per the Genesis 240p test suite. There are a lot of sources of error in my test here, but I get a consistent winner no matter how I conducted it. Keep in mind that RePlayOS is not using run ahead or any trickery like that. It's simply optimized to avoid any unnecessary frame buffering and to pull inputs very frequently. So basically it just feels great and smooth to me. When I tested performance of the original Sonic and Super Mario Bros. Games, the difference between original hardware and RePlayOS is remarkably small. In actual gameplay, I cannot perceive the difference. By the way, on screen there is an illusion of greater difference since I used mismatched screen sizes. Again, this is not a perfect test, but I hope that it nonetheless is a useful demonstration. Keep in mind too that lag differences between emulation and original hardware could vary between consoles, and I only tested 2 consoles, the Genesis and the NES, due to the time required to set this all up. So as I've said, I've had no problem whatsoever playing classic 2D platformers. They truly look and feel excellent. I can play them perfectly well on a low lag plasma like my modified S30, my OLED TV in game mode, my QD-OLED computer monitor, or a low lag LCD monitor, or a CRT. The only time I could feel the lag was when I tested RePlayOS on a significantly laggy display, and that's to be expected. The display is laggy. Let's talk about RePlayOS's user interface and a couple more features. I really appreciate the menu organization system and no-frills user interface. The interface is designed this way very intentionally. The font is perfectly readable, whether it's displayed at 240p on a CRT or rendered at 4K. Folders can be nested as you wish for perfect organization, even in the favorites menu. It's extremely easy to mark or unmark favorite games, and then later reorganize the shortcuts using a file browser. The recent games list is nice and long, and you can even remove games from it if you're embarrassed to have them shown on it with the press of a button. And again, on the subject of the favorites menu, I really like it, and I'm going to use this as a way to avoid getting overwhelmed in massive lists of complete ROM sets, because this is a serious drawback to emulation and EverDrives. You kind of get lost in this huge list at times. So to curate your ROM collection in a way is a good thing. And no, there is not an option to show box art or anything like that. But again, for me, I really like the simple, extremely fast, low maintenance, text-only approach. Now about settings. Emulation default settings are set in one menu, but individual settings can then be saved on a per console basis or even a per game basis. It's very easy to clear unwanted setting changes back to the defaults and to customize game preferences all without ever feeling overwhelmed by having too many options or too confusing of options. Controller mapping is easy too, with generally good defaults for the controllers I tested. RePlayOS features a basic screensaver that comes up at a set time if you've left the menu up. As a user of CRTs, plasmas, and OLEDs, I really appreciate this inclusion. I keep it on the 1 minute setting. Another greatly appreciated feature is called Ambiscan, which is enabled by default. With Ambiscan enabled, anything not displayed in full screen is displayed with a gently changing border color. Usually, I am very opposed to non-black borders around my aspect ratio accurate retro games, but Ambiscan is truly a welcome inclusion. By using it, I feel a bit better knowing that I'm not causing uneven wear to my plasma and OLED panels. It also even works on CRTs if you're emulating something super low resolution with a border, like the Game Gear or the Game Boy. It's a very gentle background color shift, and again, I actually really like it. It's a unique feature that I've never seen elsewhere, and I actually wish that the RetroTink 4K could do gradually shifting colors like this for masked areas instead of only a solid color of your choice. Talk about save states, rewind, fast forward, all that. So another thing I've grown to like are save states. This is, of course, absolutely nothing new to emulation, but I must admit that I appreciate having the option. I can't use save states on all my original consoles, even with mods and some top-of-the-line EverDrive models. From what I've read, save states also are not universally available on MiSTer cores either, and it's missing on some cores of the Analog Pocket, like the SNES core too. I find the convenience of save states increasingly important. At this point in my life, I don't have the time and the energy to replay tedious sections of games over and over, or to play games for very long sessions. It's nice even to use save states to skip startup screens and immediately resume gameplay. Something worth mentioning though is that there is no rewind and no fast forward support in RePlayOS, but I'm glad about this actually. Something about access to fast forward makes me feel a little antsy, and I can't quite explain it, but I feel like it's actively frying my attention span whenever I have the option, and I've tried it on other emulators. Let me know if you happen to feel the same, because I've never heard anyone else comment on this. Hopefully I'm not the only one. And as far as rewind goes, I find it a bit problematic too. When rewind is available, it takes the cheating effect of save states a bit too far. It doesn't leave me feeling fulfilled when I beat a challenging section but relied heavily on rewind. So the temptation is great to use it, and it's not always a good thing in my opinion. Though, with the added convenience of basic save states, I'm inclined now to do a lot of my retro gaming via RePlayOS, but certainly not all gaming. There are a few games that I ran into issues with during my testing. First, I seem to have encountered some issues playing rhythm games that I know well, like Parappa the Rapper and Space Channel 5. Parappa runs smoothly, and I was able to pass the first stage after a failed attempt, but it for some reason was much tougher than I recall, and I cannot pass the second stage, which is very unusual for me. I'm not quite sure what is throwing things off, but other than Parappa the Rapper, every PS1 game that I tried so far felt perfect to me and remarkably authentic. As for Space Channel 5 on the Dreamcast, I initially found it completely unplayable due to timing, but I realized that my laggy audio-video receiver was to blame. When I later tried RePlayOS's built-in support for USB audio DACs, I found the game much more playable. Still though, I feel that it is harder than when I play it on original hardware. I missed certain segments on the first stage that I can normally pass without issue, and I didn't play much beyond this point. Also keep in mind that in the gameplay footage that you're seeing now, this game, as always, has pre-rendered backgrounds, but the characters on screen are rendered in real time. I noticed some visual glitches on the characters, especially Ooh La La, so for now, primarily due to a seeming oddity in timing, I'll still be reaching for original hardware to run this game. From what I've heard, it's a notoriously difficult game to emulate in general. If you have any experiences emulating it or other rhythm games, please let me know. A couple other Dreamcast games that I emulated, however, felt excellent and ran very smoothly, even when output at 4K. There are some visual glitches, but not too many. Crazy Taxi is a good example of a popular game I tested that runs great. I don't know the intricacies of Crazy Taxi's mechanics. It's a game I'd like to master someday, but I've played it a lot nonetheless, casually, and know how it's supposed to feel. And it felt accurate here, and it was a lot of fun to play. Another popular game that I tested is Sonic Adventure 2, one of my favorites. It ran like it should, it felt fast, and it felt responsive. So while there is room for Dreamcast emulator improvement, it seems to be good overall. I didn't have to waste time studying forum posts to optimize Sonic Adventure 2 and Crazy Taxi. They just worked properly. I only spent time changing a few very basic RePlayOS menu options to my liking, like just toggling a couple things. Back on the subject of games with issues, GunCon is one. RePlayOS has a really awesome feature. It lets you plug a GunCon 2 in and use it on any light gun game with zero configuration. It's truly plug and play. The same applies to some other specialty controllers. However, on this beta release of RePlayOS, when I play GunCon, I find that it feels a bit more challenging than when I play with a real Zapper on an original NES. On an NES, I can more reliably get hits. In my brief testing so far, it feels almost as if I have to aim more precisely with the GunCon 2 to get a hit. This could just be a quirk of the GunCon 2, I'm not sure. Though if I aim perfectly or hold the GunCon 2 to the screen, it always registers the hit. It basically feels less lenient than a Zapper on original hardware. And another thing is that I'm experiencing a bug where it is difficult to select the game mode from the Duck Hunt title screen. This is something I'll have to revisit later after the next RePlayOS update and once I get my hands on the RGB Pi 2 SCART adapter. Nevertheless, for now, I must say that I at least find it very impressive that the GunCon 2 is plug and play and that it's working at all on software-based emulation. Finally, I experienced some glitches in Nintendo 64 emulation. I know that Nintendo 64 is a notoriously difficult console to emulate. Some games like Star Fox 64 and Wave Race 64 seem to play wonderfully. Others, like Zelda Ocarina of Time, surprisingly to me, have some visual glitches. I ran into a pretty significant bug in Pokemon Snap where I couldn't move the camera, which rendered it unplayable despite running smoothly. So basically there are some bugs to work out here, but older consoles that I tested, especially the PlayStation, run remarkably smoothly and feel wonderful overall. The great news though is that emulators bundled in RePlayOS are open source libretto cores, and as those are improved, RePlayOS will benefit. While the emulation cores and drivers are open source, the front-end UI of RePlayOS is closed source. The sole developer of RePlayOS goes by the name RTA, and he will be working on further enhancements and fixes, possibly even further latency improvements. From everything I've seen, he is truly dedicated to this project and passionate about accurate retro gaming and making it accessible to all. And he is working on some cool new experimental RePlayOS features right now, like automatic rotation, where you can attach a do-it-yourself sensor to your monitor, and when the monitor is rotated, the whole RePlayOS UI menu rotates with the screen. This is perfect for Tate mode, and I'm actually looking forward to grabbing an old worthless 4:3 aspect ratio Dell LCD monitor to play around with this feature, since those monitors can rotate so easily on their original stands. The developer RTA has also created an excellent website, RePlayOS.com. The site has complete, easy-to-follow instructions for installation and configuration. The search bar on the site is impressive and makes it super easy to immediately find details on any setting that I might have a question on. The site lists compatible consoles and arcade emulators with approximate compatibility for each supported version of the Raspberry Pi. Instructions are provided for where to place the BIOS files and your ROMs. It's all pretty simple though, and in a moment I'll give you a quick summary of the initial RePlayOS setup procedures. For community support and news on RePlayOS, I recommend joining the RePlayOS subreddit. I'll put a link in the description. It's a very small community currently, but hopefully we can grow it as more people discover and are able to try out RePlayOS. Alright, now let's talk briefly about that initial setup. After you download the RePlayOS image, once it's publicly available soon, you will use a simple PC program called Raspberry Pi Imager to install it to your microSD card. Complete details are on the RePlayOS website. It's an easy process nonetheless and completes quickly with just a few clicks. After RePlayOS is installed, you pop the memory card into your Raspberry Pi and allow it some time to complete its automatic initial configuration. The screen will be black during this phase, so don't power it off. Once it completes, you should then see the RePlayOS menu on your TV. For it to show though, the micro HDMI cable must be plugged into the primary HDMI port of your Pi 5, not the secondary HDMI port. Once the RePlayOS screen is shown, the configuration is complete and you can begin adding your ROMs to a newly created partition on the microSD card. Files can then be transferred directly to the microSD card via a card reader or remotely over your local network. So in summary, configuration is very easy from my perspective. The menu system is fantastic and not overwhelming. RePlayOS makes it easy to save system-specific settings, game-specific settings, and to revert back to default settings. Emulation quality is overall excellent. It feels remarkably responsive, and you can use any low latency display tech you desire. I really enjoyed this little project, even the build phase, and I plan to continue using RePlayOS for a long time to come on a variety of displays. RePlayOS, even in beta form, offers the best experience that I've ever had with software emulation. And again, this video is not sponsored. I was merely given early access to the RePlayOS beta. I bought everything for this review out of my own pocket, and these are my genuine opinions. Fortunately, I have no regrets regarding what I purchased. I've been thinking a lot lately about FPGA options, and even with the price of FPGA consoles coming down to around $200 or so, I feel like this solution at about half the cost is a great value. It has some unique benefits too. Either way you go though, there are trade-offs. And while I love original hardware, I have to admit that RePlayOS comes very close and adds a lot of convenience. I'm excited to try out the upcoming RGB Pi 2 for perfect CRT support. I'm excited to try out many arcade games on this. I'm excited to try out, there's actually a built-in video player for using with CRTs, and I'm excited to try out games from consoles I don't have the time to set up and space for. And to do this all on CRTs with native support is really exciting. Well, with all that said, let me know what you think about RePlayOS. From what you've seen and heard, how do you think it compares to the FPGA competition and original hardware? I don't have a MiSTer, so I'm curious to hear your opinions. And if you have a Pi 3, 4, or 5 on hand, definitely give it a try once it releases. Or if you're like me, before I created this video, let me know if the $100 entry price to buy the Pi and the case and the memory card and all that seems worth it to you. So with all that said, thanks for watching, everybody. I really appreciate it. I hope to catch you in the second part of this video about the RGB Pi 2 and maybe some other features of RePlayOS. Thanks again. Bye, everybody.